right. So I hope you all had a lovely long weekend. I must say that I can't figure out what day it is because I have Tuesday classes and I have sort of Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, and I started on a Tuesday and I don't know where we're at now. But hopefully you're all doing better at it than I am. At least you made it here. We're going to start talking about Chapter 2 today, which the textbook has called the Research Enterprise in Psychology. Most texts will just call this methods. And that's because what we do talk about here is how we go about doing research in psychology. So I can kind of see what they were going for. So you might remember from last week, I hope you remember from last week, that we talked about this distinction between rationalism and empiricism. And so in the field that would eventually become psychology, they started out with rationalism. And that's the idea that knowledge can be obtained through reasoning. So a lot of people sat around and thought about thinking, and that's how they were coming to understand the mind. But as we pointed out, that's not very scientific. So as that field started moving towards becoming a real science in the eyes of others, they really pushed to get more in line with empiricism, which is the idea that knowledge can be obtained through observation and experience. So in order to experience things, in order to learn things, you have to interact with your environment, and you would change your understanding practically. And so we're going to continue along that concept of empiricism and gathering information as we interact with the world, because that puts us in the right mindset for this scientific method, for the actual process of conducting scientific research. And so when we're doing psychological research, we have three broad categories of goals that we can try and fulfill. And so you'll find that some pieces of research will hit more than one, or just one, or all of these, but these are basic breakdown of what we might be looking for. So the first of our goals is measurement and description. So we want to look in more depth at a particular phenomena that we observe. Maybe we've noticed that there's a particular behavior on campus. So we would like to quantify that, so we would like to measure it, and then tell others what we've observed. So maybe we've noticed that people wear a specific color on a specific day. And so we'd like to count the number of students that wear that color on that day, and then tell other people. Or maybe we want to present it as a portion of the population. Maybe 10% of people are wearing red on a particular day. So that's our first step. We've measured it and we've described it. Our next step that we might choose to try and pursue is understanding and prediction. So maybe it isn't enough that you know that 10% of people are wearing red. Maybe you want to know why they're wearing red. Maybe there was a flyer that went up fast machine, or maybe it's some internet thing. So you'd like to understand where it's coming from and maybe see if you can predict it. So if you think that it was because somebody put up flyers and that color, maybe you put up your own flyers and see if you could find similar performance on a different day. So you predict what outcome you might see if you got the cause right. And then the last of these potential goals is application and control. So if you figure out what's causing the behavior you're looking at, maybe you want to make use of it. Maybe you want to apply it to a situation or control that behavior in a time or place. So maybe you want a bunch of people to wear a particular color and you learned that putting up maybe you want to do better than that. You want to sort of control that behavior, make it more common, put up more flyers. I don't know. But it's some way that you use what you learned by changing the behavior by control what people are doing. And so like I said, each of these goals doesn't have to be standalone. Sometimes you do start with a measurement type research experiment. And then once you describe it, then you want to go about understanding it. And then after that, you want to go about controlling it. and changing it and applying it in some kind of situation. Sometimes somebody's already measured, so you don't have to do that step. Maybe you just want to understand why, or, all sorts of different combinations. But this is sort of our general breakdown of what these are. So next we're going to talk about the scientific method. Now, I always try and warn people that you see the scientific method in lots of different classes. I actually have 4 different intro science classes at home, and every single one of them has a different scientific method listed. Not because they're all very, very different, but because they choose to cut it up different ways. So the process from the beginning to the end is more or less the same no matter where you see it. But different texts, different people will choose step 1 to be something slightly different, or step 3 is different. And I just want to draw your attention to that because it can be confusing. If you've done other classes, they've covered the scientific method because they all disagree on how to develop it. I keep that in mind, and it kind of falls in with my method of testing, which is I wouldn't do something like ask you, what is step 4 of the scientific method? That's not super helpful. But maybe I would give you a list of things that you can do, and maybe ask you what's the right order. Or I might talk about somebody is doing this thing. So the numbers here, the take home is just that they're fairly arbitrary. So don't panic if they're different than what you're familiar with. That being said, we are going to follow our textbook's listing of the numbers, but we care about the progression as opposed to that hard division. So when we start off with the scientific method, one of the first things that you're going to do is put together some kind of testable hypothesis. You've observed some kind of thing in your environment, and you'd like to make a hypothesis that you can test. You'd like to conduct an experiment that will answer a particular question. So I'm trying to think of the example that I had in mind. I always have to write these down because I forget. Okay. So you want to see if seeing a particular kind of advertisement can change people's emotions. So you want to get people to feel excited for an upcoming event or something like that. So you want to see if you can manipulate their emotions using some kind of advertisement. So that's the basic start with one of the place we want to start out at. So we want to formulate a specifically testable hypothesis. When we get into on experiment specifically, we break down between a thesis and a hypothesis. But for right now, we're going to say that a hypothesis is something specific, something testable, and it's a prediction about what we should observe if we were to carry out our study. So our specific hypothesis in this example would be that seeing a particular advertisement increase people's excitement level. So if our idea in general holds true, then seeing this advertisement will increase excitement. All right, so that's our testable hypothesis, and that actually starts setting us up for the next step, which is actually selecting a research method and choosing a design for our study. So we want to see something about excitement levels, and we want to see if exposure to a particular advertisement affects that. Okay, so we need those 2 moving parts. So maybe we want to have undergraduate students because that's who we have access to, and we would like to show them this advertisement. And then after seeing that advertisement, we would like to measure their excitement levels. Maybe we're going to use heart rate or skin conductance or something like that. And if we want to do a good experiment, we'll also want to be able to compare that to something. So maybe we want to compare it to their heart rate before they see the advertisement versus after the advertisement. Or maybe we want to compare people who saw the advertisement to people who saw some kind of neutral image. We can make that decision at this step based on what it is we specifically want to look at. Maybe we want to do a good job and we'll do both just to be safe, because working with humans is difficult. But once you've picked your design, once you know the method you're going to use, you can actually carry it out. And it's summarized in the nice, simple, you collect the data. Now, this is the part of the experiment that tends to take quite a long time. Not necessarily the longest time. Writing it up at the end is usually the longest time, but collecting the data can take a very long time, depending on what kind of research you're doing. If you're doing, say, a longitudinal study where you watch people grow up, you can be collecting data for years. You can be collecting data for decades. So that stage is a little bit deceptive, but in some way you will carry out the design that you chose and you will measure what you decided you were going to measure. Now that you've done that, you can analyze the data that you collected and draw some kind of conclusions about it. This is where statistics happen, where you start making some decisions about whether there was a difference in their excitement level before and after seeing that advertisement. Or was there a difference in the participants who saw the advertisement versus those who saw a neutral image? That's where we can draw our conclusions, and we can say if there was a statistical difference between the things we're comparing. And then once you have those findings, you want to report them. So you'd like to share what you found with the world. So in this case, you'll usually present your research findings in one of two ways. The first is to go to some kind of scientific meeting or conference. You can stand up and talk at a poster or give a talk in front of a group of people. Both of those are ways of sharing your findings. And so as an academic, you'd actually report both of those instances in your CV, your academic equivalent resume, to show that you can share your research and that you've done research that's worthy of sharing. The other and possibly more common way to do this is actually to publish your findings in a scientific journal. So you might submit your paper to a scientific journal. That journal should be peer-reviewed, which means that others in the area, so other experts in that field, will read your paper and give you critical feedback. Sometimes they'll point out potential errors or flaws in your research design that you may not have noticed. Other times, if you're really, really lucky, or maybe really good, you'll get, it looks fine, we'll take it. I've never had that happen, but I know people who it's happened to. They'll as others who are interested in your research to read about it, see what you did, and see what you found. That is another one of those things that's a little bit deceptive because you don't always immediately report your findings. At least in my experience, you get to the end, you draw your conclusions, and you go, something didn't quite go the way we planned. Or maybe we didn't understand this as well as we thought we did. We need to make some changes. And that's when you get experiment 2, or 3, or 4, all in one paper, where you go back and revisit things like your research method and design. So instead of reporting, you can occasionally hop back to fix things. You'll report the stuff that you did that didn't work, so that you share that knowledge and people know what doesn't exist or doesn't work, but sometimes you don't go straight into publishing. I just find that the textbook versions are always a little bit more idealistic than reality. All right, so before we get into talking about actually collecting data and doing research, I want to talk about a couple of different terms that are going to come up pretty frequently throughout this chapter, and then are going to carry over into the rest of the course, because once we learn about doing research, we're going to talk about research that's been done. So with these terms, some of them we've already kind of snuck into discussions, some of them we've mentioned without giving a name yet, but this is where I put it all on paper and sort of show the real description to you. So the first of these is a variable. And a variable is basically a catch-all term for any characteristic, anything of interest that can vary. So in my example of showing people an advertisement or showing them a neutral image, the thing that they see is a variable. It's what they were exposed to. And there's different levels of that. There's advertisement or no advertisement. So we can call that a variable, and we have 2 levels that it varies at. If we were measuring heart rate, that would be another variable. And that one isn't just two levels, that would be a continuous variable because we can have any real number. But that's a little bit beyond what we need for this class. But that's another variable, and different people can have different heart rates, and that heart rate should be corresponding to their excitement level, which actually brings us into our operational definition. Now, an operational definition specifically defines a variable in terms of the procedures that we use to either produce or measure. So I talked about exposure to images, and we said you're either shown the advertisement or no advertisement. We've told people exactly what it was that we're doing in order to determine if they're in the ad group or no ad group. We would also talk about our construct of interest. The concept we're trying to measure was excitement, but that's a really abstract thing to measure, so we said we're going to approximate it using heart rate. I mentioned you could also use something like skin conductance, or there's all sorts of things you can use there. But we said our experiment, we're specifically using heart rate. So we've given an operational definition for us. Excitement level is going to be measured using a heart rate. And in a scientific paper, you would go further than that. You wouldn't just say that you're measuring heart rate, you would say how you're measuring heart rate. Are you using a Fitbit? Are you using a full heart rate monitor? What are you going to use to get that measurement? So this information is really important because if somebody is reading your research, telling them how you looked at things, exactly what you did, gives them a better idea of what your findings mean, what you are doing specifically, so that the outcomes have more meaning to them. For those of us who want to do research, we might look at somebody's paper, read their operational definitions and their methods, and go, okay, I'd like to see if I can replicate or repeat this experiment using a different sample. I want to see if this holds true for more than just first-year undergraduate students. I want to see if this works in people who are over the age of 30 or whatever. So having those definitions gives us a very concrete, measurable construct of what it is that we're looking at. The next thing that we can see is the terms participant or subject. And so sometimes you'll see these used interchangeably. So an umbrella term for both of those would be that they're the organisms that the behavior is being recorded in a study. So these are the organisms that are being studied. The practice tends to be that participants refers to humans who participate in research. So if I talk about surveying undergraduate students, those students are participants in the study. Whereas we would use the term subjects for non-human animals. So if I was talking about chickadee research, we might say that we used 18 subjects in the study, meaning that we had 18 chickadees doing a task. So again, sometimes you'll see them interchangeably, but the convention is participants for people and everything else is subjects. And then I already went on my little bit of a tangent about scientific journals and scientific meetings. I should also mention that statistics are, keep it at a very high level here, where we don't go into lots of detail. So we'll talk about statistics as the things that we use to analyze data. And we will run statistics or conduct statistics to decide if we supported our hypothesis or not. So we're going to make an determination of if there was a difference between people who saw the ad versus not the ad. We would use statistics to make that determination. So for this class, I will talk about statistics, but I won't have you actually conduct any statistics. Most of what we get in this class is I would show you something like maybe somebody has reported something as statistically significant. What does that mean? Well, that means that there's a difference between the two groups, or something like that, depending on the situation. So we'll talk a little bit more about, say, p-values and those kinds of things, but not to the level of calculating it. I do find that statistics tend to intimidate some people, and I was honestly one of those people that hated statistics and avoided it until my last year of undergrad. And I still hated it after taking the class, but once I did research and I actually used statistics, I've kind of warmed up to them. So hopefully giving here's the purpose, here's the use of it, makes them a little bit more inviting, I guess. So for the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about specific types of data collection techniques that are fairly common within psychology. So when we say that you collect data, it's usually going to fall under one of these 6 categories. There's, of course, always going to be some that are kind of, you could divide it up one way or the other, but for the most part, these are pretty good categories. The first of these is direct observation. So this is when you watch and record behavior as quickly and precisely as possible. So this might be you sit on a bench and have a notebook and you record the number of cars that drive by in a specific time window. Or maybe you could do something like a video camera and how many people walk into or out of a particular door in a day. That would both of those would be direct observation. So you are sitting and watching using some kind of objective measurement. So in both of those situations, we might have a very strong operational definition, specified that you're looking at cars in a particular window, maybe they have to be going in a particular direction or something like that, so that you can be objective and precise, and then you don't count things that don't meet your specific criteria for counting. Then, yep.
So this
Yeah, so each of these techniques for collecting data would be decided at that choose your procedure stage. So you would decide which of these lines up best with the question you want to answer. Yeah, and sometimes there's on things like what you have available to you. So we use the example of, we're going to have undergraduates and we're going to have them do that exposure to a thing, and then we're going to measure their heart rate, which we'll see as a physiological recording. But maybe that's not something you can do. Maybe you don't have access to that. So maybe you have to put up a billboard and stop strangers on the street and ask them to quantify how excited they are about the thing you're advertising. So you're limited based on what it is you're studying, but also what you have available, which are all really fun limitations to consider. All right, so the next of these is a questionnaire, and this is a really big one for psychology. This is when you have a series of written questions that are designed to obtain information about attitudes, opinions, and specific aspects of behavior. Basically, you design a set of questions that are meant to ask people to respond in a way that gives us an idea of whatever we're interested in. So their attitude, it could be, what is your political affiliation? It could be, do you think positively or negatively of trees? Whatever you want to look at. So what is their attitude towards a thing? Their opinion about a thing. Or we could even ask them something like, how often do you engage in this kind of behavior? Questionnaires allow us to get at really whatever we can frame as a question. Typically, you'll see most questionnaires done with sort of here's a range to answer. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree with the statement? Or how many times a week do you engage in this behavior? 0 to that, this to another number, and that or more. You can frame lots of things as questionnaires. More rarely you will see like open-ended questionnaires, but those are problematic for a lot of reasons, so they tend to be pretty rare. We'll also occasionally see interviews, which are kind of like questionnaires, but they're conducted face-to-face. And this is another one of those that kind of needs a caveat with modern psychology. Modern meaning anything since telephone became common. But you can do an interview over the phone, you can do it over video, you can do them in person. There's lots of different options there. I just found it funny that the text implies that an interview is some kind of face-to-face dialogue, but you can expand that definition to anywhere that you are directly interacting with someone and recording their responses. Interviews tend to be a little bit more open-ended than questionnaires, just because you're asking them out loud and it's hard to get people to do sort of selected responses when you ask questions in that format. All right, next we have psychological tests. And as you can imagine, this is another one that's really, really common in psychology. So psychological tests are standardized measures that are used to obtain a sample of a subject's behavior. So you can think of something like an IQ test. An IQ test is a psychological test, and it's a standardized way of quantifying somebody's relative intelligence in terms of what that test uses intelligence. When you get to study that chapter, I don't know if it's in 104 or 105, there's some issues with intelligence testing because of what they're studying, how they're studying it. So it's not really a good absolute mark of intelligence, but I suppose that's a debate for another day. We could look at something like your ability to reason, how you approach problems, something like that. We could do personality tests. That is a standardized measure trying to get at someone's personality type. There's lots of different psychological tests. And these are actually really useful because they already exist in a lot of cases. You can make new psychological tests. That is totally possible. But for years of use or modifying existing ones to try and make them better, just because they're already standardized, we already know how they perform in lots of populations, and they give us a pretty good measure that we can compare to other people. We already kind of refer to the physiological recording or neural recording. So this is when you have an instrument that is going to directly monitor and record specific physiological processes within a subject. So my example of heart rate would be a physiological recording. You can measure skin conductance, which is how quickly a current can travel across the surface of your skin. You use 2 electrodes and see if that current changes. The way that works is very low voltage, you don't feel it, but as you get more worked up about something, people tend to sweat, and even just a little bit of sweat can cause a massive change in skin conductance. So we can measure things like anxiety or any kind of being worked up or measuring skin conductance because it's something that changes very predictably. We can also do neural recording, so we can go as fine as, say, single neuron recording. Same thing, you have 2 electrodes, but this time you would put them across a neuron, across a whole cell, and you would detect changes in charge along the cell. And so you can tell when the cell has fired, so when it's active, because you would read a difference. So you can measure when particular neurons are active in the brain. Or you can look at a much larger scale. You can use things like brain scans to see which parts of the brain are active and involved when different tasks are being done. Those would all count there. And the last is something that I find strangely gets overlooked quite often. And this is examining archival records. So this is when you can use existing institutional records to try and understand something from the data. And for me, as coming not from psychology, this wouldn't have even occurred to me. But psychologists are really good at making databases that might have been collected for a completely different purpose. So if you've ever heard of the Minnesota Twin Study, that's a fantastic resource that has lots and lots of medical information on twins born in Minnesota. It wasn't intended for psychological research, but because they had collected that data and because they had it available, it became a really good way to start looking at maybe there are genetic factors underlying different kinds of behaviors or psychological disorders. So they can co-opt places that have really good records, and maybe they measure things like as they get older, what kind of health problems did they have, or were they ever treated for this or that? You might look at, trying to think of other places. Greenland has a really great record of mental health hospitalizations, and so it's another way that you can look at the carryover of different kinds of psychological disorders within family trees. There's all sorts of stuff like that, where it was collected for some completely different purpose, and some psychologist went, I wonder what we can do with that. And most of it's related to medical type data, but there are quite a few different kinds of archives that exist. So, all right, so next we're going to go into our different types of research studies. And so when you typically think of research, I know most people think about scientific experiments. Experiments and research seem to go fairly hand in hand. However, you might have started to figure out from some of our discussions already that in psychology, not all research is experimental. We'll also see descriptive research. So we're going to look at some descriptive methods, which are any means of capturing, reporting, recording, any of those synonyms of describing a particular group or the traits of a particular group. So we'll talk about sort of the difference between a population and a sample later on, but for now, our group is the particular sample of people that we're looking at. So that's what we're caring about. You'll sometimes see descriptive methods and correlational research used pretty much interchangeably, but I find that's not entirely accurate. The descriptive methods is just saying that we're describing these groups. Correlational research is specifically looking at making comparisons, looking at the relationship between two or more variables. So you can obtain the measures of each of those variables using a descriptive method, but it's not correlational research unless you're specifically trying to find the relationship, looking for a correlation between those two variables. So it's another one of those, you'll see them used interchangeably, but they're not precisely overlapped. So descriptive methods is more preferred, but if I talk about correlational research, then now you know that I'm talking about specifically comparing two measured variables. And we'll spend a whole bunch of time on correlations later, so hopefully this will sink in pretty well by the end of this chapter. But we have 4 different types of descriptive methods that we're going to go over. And again, we're sort of focusing on the ones that are most important or most critical for psychology. So the first of these is naturalistic observation. And in this case, you're going to be observing behavior without manipulation. And you're going to find that's pretty consistent across all of our descriptive methods, because manipulation is one of those hallmarks of experiments. So when we're just describing the behavior, we're not trying to change it, we're not trying to manipulate it, we're not trying to get some kind of causal relationship by changing things. All we're doing is observing and maybe reporting some covariances, some correlations between related variables. So we're talking about how we can go about collecting the data that we need in order to make those judgments. So with naturalistic observation, you're basically going to go out into the world and observe different organisms in their natural environment. So this is one of the most representative types of research because it's going to represent that real world behavior because you're observing them in the real world. Kind of makes sense. As an example, you could think of Jane Goodall studying apes. So she went out into the wild where they lived, and she observed them in their natural habitat. She did some of the things that are actually really useful with naturalistic observation, things like giving them time to acclimatize or get used to her presence. We talked about the fact that humans are especially reactive, but pretty much all organisms have some level of reactivity. So going into their environment can cause their behavior to change. So with naturalistic observation, you really want that acclimatization period where they get used to you being there and their behavior goes back to normal. So for our downsides of naturalistic behavior, it's kind of obvious. We have no control over the behavior. So things are going to happen when they happen because we have no say over it. So this can be problematic if you're, say, looking to study a rare behavior. Maybe you want to study altruism, which is a situation where one organism will act in such a way that puts themselves at risk to benefit another without actually gaining anything tangible in return. That's a very interesting concept that we'll talk about later in the course. And people really want to understand what's going on there because natural selection says that that kind of behavior should only exist if it leads to improved survival or improved fitness of the organism who's doing the acting. But it doesn't seem to be the case. But of course, that only occurs in situations where a risky situation occurs and that behavior isn't always observed. You might have to watch these organisms for a very, very, very long time in order to observe even one case of what you're looking for. So naturalistic observations are time-consuming. You're not guaranteed to see the behavior that you're looking for, especially if it's a rare behavior. Our other problem is, again, common to all of our descriptive methods, and this is that it's really difficult to determine the exact cause of behaviors. We mentioned that there's lots of different factors going on, that behaviors are influenced by lots of different things, and that's true across all kinds of behavior. So when we're trying to study it, if we can't control or hold constant all those extra factors, we can't be certain that the behavior that we're seeing is caused by this particular thing because there might have been something else going on that was involved. So with our descriptive methods, we can describe that it happened, and we can say that it also happened at the same time as something else. So there's an association between those two things, but we can't make a concrete causal conclusion there. We can't say that this event caused that occurrence. We can only say that they're probably associated. So we can find those correlations, we can find those relationships between things, but causal determinations are restricted mainly to experiments. And there's another giant floating asterisk with that statement, but that's for much higher level classes. Our next type of descriptive study is participant observation. And this has a lot of overlaps with the naturalistic observation, which hopefully the names kind of hint at. But in this case, we have our researchers directly interact with the population of interest by basically becoming a participant themselves. So this is really good if you're trying to study a particular group. Maybe you want to investigate a cult, or maybe you want to better understand a particular culture. So the researcher would become one of the people living like that. They would go live with that cult or go immerse themselves in that culture in order to try and find some insights from the participants' perspective. So they observe what's going on in their group of interest by becoming part of that group. Now, we have another bunch of things to consider here on top of our usual issues with descriptive methods. We also have to keep in mind that the researchers themselves are individuals, and we have that problem with biases and differences in interpretation based on their previous experiences. So their perception of the group is going to be colored or shifted based on what they've experienced in the past. So it's not going to be an objective or concrete description of what's happening. We have to keep in mind that anything that they tell us about is sort of coming through their own perception of the event. So again, back to that whole, it's really hard to study humans because humans are difficult to study. We also have that issue where the observations that they are seeing, the things that are happening around them, they're not predictable. They might not repeat. It might be really hard to get certain things to occur, and because we're just observing, we're not manipulating, we're not in control of those events at all, so we may never see that observation again, or it may never occur, which can be frustrating if you're trying to look at one particular thing. Next, we can talk about case studies. And this is another one of those where the name tends to be associated with one thing, but it's a little bit broader than that. So when you think of a case study, you tend to think of an in-depth study of a single individual. And an in-depth study of a single individual can be a case study, but it isn't the only type of case study that there is. Case studies can also be an in-depth study of a single group. So maybe we want to look at There's a particular culture that's been very isolated from the other cultures around them, and we want to study this one particular group in depth to learn more about it. That would also be a case study, even though there are multiple people that we're looking at, because we're still looking at a single case, a single group that falls under the same sort of umbrella. We might also have a single situation. Maybe people encountered a strange occurrence. You want to study forest fires, so you're going to look at everyone who was affected by a particular forest fire. That could be a situational case study for that one particular group who experienced that situation. So I just draw attention to that because there's usually a misconception that case studies are only a single person, but you can also look at a group as a single entity, or those who experience a situation as a single entity as well. So case here has sort of a little bit of a broader meaning. But in all of these cases, we're going to have a very in-depth look at some factor that is interesting about that individual, that group, or that situation. So in psychology, a lot of the case studies that we see are individuals that have had some kind of brain damage. So on the next slide, we have one of the most famous psychology case study patients, and this is Henry Molaison, or HM. And so he had very, very bad epileptic seizures, and in order to try and stop those seizures, they had part of his brain surgically removed. So his hippocampus was removed. You can see it's an empty spot right in the middle there, versus a normal brain where the tissue connects all the way into the middle. And so we have this change in his brain that wasn't something that was manipulated in order to study how it affected anything in his behavior, but it so happened that this did help his epileptic seizures. The downside is that it did lead to issues forming long-term memory, as we mentioned last time. So because this had happened, he was a special case, and it showed us something interesting about the formation of long-term memory. We can study him very in depth, or we could study him very in depth to see what detriments were associated with this kind of damage. And of course, we have our limitations here. It's still not an experiment. We're still not manipulating anything. We are just making use of existing cases that might be interesting. So we still can't draw those causal relationships. With HM, we can't say if it was the loss of, say, the whole area that he lost that led to no long-term memory. Maybe it was just a portion of that. Or maybe there was trauma caused by the removal of the hippocampus and there was some other part that was affected. We can't know exactly what was going on that led to that kind of brain damage, that kind of detriment to his memory. And so we have to keep in mind that until we can see lots and lots of people who have this kind of detriment in their memory and potentially have damage to the same area, we can't really have that causal conclusion that this is definitely the only thing driving that kind of performance change. And of course, it seems kind of weird because as researchers trying to study this sort of thing, it's really interesting and you get really excited that we get to study this case. And sometimes it's easy to forget that these are actual people who have had certain things happen to them. So it's weird to be excited about things that have gone wrong for others, but it's one of those strange things of being a psychologist, I suppose. And then the last slide that I want to cover today is surveys. So this is our last descriptive method. And so this is what would be sort of those questionnaires or interviews. This is where we can ask questions to try and extract specific information from a group of people. Surveys are really beneficial because they're fairly easy to administer. Especially if you have some kind of standardized test, you can nowadays just send people a link to a website and ask them to go through all the questions. Even if you're doing it in person, you can have a piece of paper, you can give them like a Scantron, and go through a bunch of multiple choice questions. And because a lot of them are standardized, it's really easy to crunch that data fairly quickly. And because of those easy delivery methods, it's also very effective as a method of getting lots of information in a very short time span. So even though surveys aren't necessarily the most accurate because we're stuck relying on people's truthfulness in their reporting, it is good to have lots and lots of information and to get really large samples because you can ask lots of people. We just have to keep in mind that because we're asking people questions, we are susceptible to biases on both the side of the researchers and the participants. So researchers can have bias in how they interpret data. They can cause bias in the way that they ask questions. Questions can be worded in leading ways that can influence how people tend to answer them. And we talk about the fact that participants can change their answers based on what they think you want to hear or based on what they think will make them look better on paper. So lots of things to consider there. But that covers all of our descriptive methods. And then in the next class, we're going to start talking about experimental research and then a little bit about statistics, and we'll wrap up with ethics if we get that far.